As a coach, volume and intensity are two variables that I'm constantly trying to manipulate to create adaptations that are going to produce strength gains. Within that, there's not really a particular right or wrong. I think if you look through the industry, there is a vast variety of opinions when it comes to volume versus intensity and how people program. And so what I want to kind of propose with this video is not some kind of set rules or standard of how I use volume and intensity or how you should use them, more so a theoretical discussion of kind of how I frame volume and intensity, how I look at it within the perspective of novice, intermediate, and advanced lifters, and kind of just general trends I see within powerlifting, whether it's my athletes or other athletes, and kind of things that I see that maybe aren't proven, they don't have any research backing to it, but more so I think have some type of anecdotal experiential evidence that points me in directions that leads to kind of my principles on how I adjust and manipulate volume and intensity for novice, intermediate, and advanced lifters. So to kind of lead that off, while this isn't necessarily set in stone true, I look at volume as a physiological adaptation, and I look at intensity as a neurological adaptation. Well, that's not, like I said, it's not truly what they are. It's kind of how I lay the framework. If we're going to do higher volume, we're probably going to see a good amount of physiological adaptation in the sense of muscle growth. I mean, that's probably why we're going to increase volume for one of the reasons. Whereas if we're going to push higher intensities, we're looking for more neurological adaptations. I mean, the general thought process is we have muscle. Muscle doesn't mean we're strong, but it gives us the more muscle we have, the higher ceiling we have for strength. So we use volume to produce and gain muscle, and then we use intensity to maximize it. Within that, when we're looking at volume and intensity is our main stimulus to produce strength, or our main stimulus for adaptation, in my opinion. Volume is the extent of that stimulus. So if we do one set of 5 at a certain intensity, that is producing a stimulus. If we do more sets, we are furthering the effect of that stimulus with some type of deteriorating effect. We can't just continue to do more sets and more sets and more sets and get the same effect. Every set thereafter has some type of lesser effect than the previous one. It's finding optimal amount of sets and volume and intensity that's going to be able to produce the adaptations and progress we want in each individual lifter. Also within this, volume and intensity are both tools for skill practice, but in different manners. Volume is the ability to practice more repetitions. It would be like shooting a free throw shot. We are able to do a lot of repetitions over and over and over. But that doesn't mean we always get better as a power lifter with these types of reps, because we not only need to be good at performing sub-maximal reps, we need to be good at performing maximal reps. And you see some people who can do sets of 9 with weights that project to these insane numbers of 1 RM, but then when they actually get to those, anything close to it, they can't actually produce that same strength when it comes to displaying their 1 RM strength. So we also need the aspect of performing at that maximal capability through intensity, that where volume would be more like shooting free throws. Intensity is more like playing a full-on basketball game to go to the extent of what we're going to see when we're actually in competition. So we need both in the sense of skill practice. So how does this apply to novice, beginners, and intermediate lifters? So a general framework that you can work off of is that a novice lifter compared to an advanced lifter is going to need a different macro cycle of training. And what I mean by that, let's just use the example that we have 3 training blocks in a macro cycle. If I have a novice lifter, they may be doing 2 volume-based blocks and 1 strength-based block. They need more volume in their overall training plan due to the need to build more muscle tissue. They need more physiological effect at this point to build a capacity for strength than to worry about trying to maximize strength with their minimal muscle mass in the first place. The opposite, an advanced lifter, maybe we need less volume, so maybe we only do 1 volume block and we do 2 more strength-based blocks. Again, that's not set in stone. This is just theoretical of kind of how we're looking at it. And then with an intermediate lifter, it's probably some kind of combination. It might just be dependent on each individual and kind of what they're needing at that time. But there's this slow transition of a novice lifter probably needing more bodybuilding type work and an advanced lifter needing more high intensity competition specific work, which leads to the next point, is that we could also look at novice, intermediate, and advanced as the level of competition specificity we need within our training. There's a high likelihood that a novice and an intermediate in particular are going to be able to have more transfer of strength from some type of variation like a pause squat or a tempo squat or a safety bar squat or high bar versus low bar to their actual competition list, because they have so much room to improve. Whereas if we get more advanced, we're going to have to be more specific in our training. Two great examples of that is Yuri Belkin and Andrei Milanichev, which if you don't know both of them, they only squat, bench, and deadlift. And competition squat, competition bench, competition deadlift. As far as I know, and the supposed rumors, they don't do any accessory work. They just do those three movements because at their point in their training careers and what they need to do, that's the only thing that's going to make them better. So as we progress, we need to also be more specific in what our training is doing. If we want to be a better power lifter, we need to be more specific to powerlifting training and competition specific training. As we look across the powerlifting spectrum, we can kind of see this playing out as well. If you go on Instagram, you can pretty much see everyone's training logs being laid out in front of you of kind of what they're doing. And what we're typically seeing is these novice intermediates, and that can even be, that's usually more training age, but also that kind of relates back to their actual age as well. But I'm going to use the example, we see a lot of junior lifters doing these high volume programs and seeing unbelievable results from them. And there's multiple reasons for that. And this video isn't to dive in every single reason of why a training program might work. But again, just looking at evidence in front of us, we're seeing a lot of evidence that junior lifters and younger lifters or younger training age lifters are having high response to higher volume training programs. Versus if we tend to look at a lot of lifters who have been around for a while, not that they aren't doing higher reps and higher volume, but we tend to see them doing a lot more higher intensity work. And it's becoming more specific that they're having to do certain things to be able to elicit those strength gains. So, and I think you can even see that with coaches. I'm going to use the example of Mike Teixeira. Mike Teixeira is an unbelievable strength coach who's extremely popular within powerlifting, has done a lot of amazing contributions. If you look at the majority of his lifters, are more advanced. They're typically high-level open lifters or masters lifters who've been training for a long time. And if you look at Mike Teixeira's training style, comparatively, he's fairly low volume. Even though he does higher reps, I would say his volume is lower because he tends to push relative intensities really high. And when I say intensity, that can also mean relative versus absolute intensities, because we'll talk about kind of junk volume in a little bit as well. But you see Mike really using intensity as his gauge. You're going to see a lot of 8 to 9 RPE sets from his lifters, and we see results from that. But I also think when you see the lifters that are being coached by him, they tend to be lifters who have been training a while and probably have done more of this base laying of volume and bodybuilding style work and less specific work for a long time, and maybe have maximized their progress from that. And then as they work into this more specific, high intensity, high exertion work, that's the way to be able to get that extra 1, 2, 3% when it comes to being a internationally competitive athlete. And on the other end of the spectrum, with coaches, you see some coaches who coach primarily younger lifters. And whether it's just by the choice of who they attract, just like Mike Teixeira attracts more advanced, more experienced and training age lifters, maybe these coaches just are attracting younger lifters and it has nothing to do with the training program. I could be completely wrong on this, but I think there's enough evidence that we're seeing a lot of these coaches who tend to like to push high volume see a lot of progress with these junior lifters and get more junior lifters because other juniors and younger training age lifters are seeing that because that's what they're going to respond to at that point in their training career. It doesn't mean an advanced lifter can't respond to these higher volume training programs. It's just that I think in the broad spectrum of things, that's generally where things are going to kind of fall into place. There's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be individual differences, but I look at the training age of someone and most people, I mean, even dating back to before the rise of popularity, a lot of us came from a bodybuilding background. Ronnie Coleman, crazy strong. He built an amazing foundation to be able to build strength. And I think a lot of the people that actually are dominating right now in powerlifting were people that were bodybuilding 5-6 years ago, transferred to powerlifting, already kind of got that volume base out of the way. And we saw that kind of competition specificity reign supreme for like 2015 to 2016 time when everything was about just squat, bench, deadlift, don't do anything else. And I think that may have worked to an extent at that time because a lot of those people were coming from bodybuilding backgrounds and didn't need this high variation variation, low specificity, high volume training at the point. They just needed to maximize their training within powerlifting and being more intensive based and more specific. Now that powerlifting is becoming more well-rounded and we're having people start powerlifting from the get-go, we're going to start seeing more of how this development through their entire training age and from novice, intermediate to advanced goes. And I've had some lifters kind of go through that process, and I'll kind of touch on one of them, Patrick, in a little bit of kind of what we've seen over the last 3 years and how we've had to adjust his training to be able to continue to elicit strength gains. Another example we can look at with just athletes and coaching in general is we can look at the West Side and Bulgarian method. Whether I or you agree with either of those methods doesn't matter. They produce results. But if you look at who they produce results for, they're typically already advanced athletes. West Side typically was getting people who had been training for years. You heard Louis time and time again, oh, this guy came out with a 700-pound squat, and within 3 months he was a 1,000-pound squat. That might be an exaggeration, but we hear him talk about that all the time. Well, the guy came in with a 700-pound squat. He probably was pretty darn strong and pretty well built at that time. And Louis takes that maximal effort, high intensity training and elicits those neurological strength progression that maybe they were missing out on with their previous work. Same with the Bulgarian system. You're taking world-class athletes in Bulgaria. You are having them max nonstop. They probably already have an extensive foundation of muscle mass, an extensive foundation of training. They've probably been training since they're teens or younger. And now you're just maximizing that potential. And outside of just Bulgaria with the Bulgarian method, I've heard a lot of times from different people who've experimented with max out every day or squat every day programs or the similar Bulgarian method. It doesn't tend to go very well unless it's preceded by some higher volume training. And usually that kind of leads back to needing that volume to elicit some type of physiological or even neurological adaptation that we need to hold on to for a certain amount of point while we're doing this max everyday style programming. And eventually we see that have a deteriorating effect because we start to lose those adaptations from prior training cycles. So they all kind of go hand in hand. But again, this is just kind of a thought process and overview of what we typically see to give an idea of what we should have for expectation wise of how we may have to adapt, change, and progress our training throughout our training age. Coming back around and touching on junk volume, pretty much the opposite of the Bulgarian method and the West Side method. The term junk volume is thrown around. I don't know if it has there's not really a great idea of exactly what would consider junk volume, like what's the exact percentage or RP. That's not really what I want to talk about though, but we understand that there's some type of volume that may not really be very useful. But in my personal experience, with lifters I have that are very much novice lifters and have barely been lifting, let alone, not just powerlifting, but lifting in general, that junk volume tends to elicit some type of progress. I have one lifter in particular who's 18, and we have done a lot of very, very, very submaximal training with his competition movements and really just pushed in for a long time, like very submaximal, what you consider junk volume on the squat, bench, and deadlift to really just work on form and to push volume within that. But mainly we got our intensity from more of the accessory movements. But while you could argue that maybe just the accessories did most of the work and the technique aspect of the training with the competition movements is what mattered, I would argue that for a really novice lifter, some type of junk volume probably can still elicit some kind of adaptation. Whereas when we're getting more and more advanced, we're probably going to see a lesser effect or no effect from this kind of junk volume where we're not going to really get anything out of it other than maybe an aspect of skill progress. But when it comes to some type of physiological adaptation or neurological adaptation, we're probably not going to get anything from that. And one thing that does need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about volume versus intensity is natural versus enhanced lifters. I do think that definitely plays a role because an enhanced lifter is going to have an easier time building muscle with lower levels of volume. They're also probably going to hold on to adaptations later. That's probably the single biggest difference I feel like I see is that they're able to hold on to adaptations for a longer period of time than some natural lifters. Like you see a lot of times some of these natural lifters are hitting sets of 7 the week before a competition, because if they take those out, they're going to start losing the adaptations they have gotten from previous cycles of those higher volume blocks. Whereas I think the more typical Western periodization approach kind of came from the fact that it was being produced and used by not West Side lifters, but enhanced lifters. Maybe that's not going to transfer as well to a natural lifter, but a lot of what we see as old school powerlifting in theology was coming from enhanced lifters, and they very well could still be able to hold on to those adaptations from 2-3 blocks before of higher volume and be doing just sets of 1 to 3 reps and still be able to see progress from that, because they aren't going to lose those muscle gains or lose those adaptations from previous training blocks. So taking this information now and looking at it in more of a practical application, I had mentioned earlier about one of my lifters, Patrick, who I've coached for probably a little over 3 years now, who we've very much seen this progression from intermediate to advanced, and we've had to adjust how we approach volume and intensity based off of that. To give a little background on Patrick, before I started coaching him 3 years ago, he'd probably been powerlifting for about a year. He had added, I think, 200 pounds to his total in that time, so he was a very well-built guy. He had been lifting for years before and been an athlete in college, but powerlifting specific training was new to him. So he had about a year under his belt, and I would consider him within that time an intermediate, because he still had extensive resistance training history before, just not super specific to powerlifting. So when I first started coaching him, probably, while intensity is always going to be an aspect of our progression, probably the main driver of progress we use was volume. We were trying, I look at volume a lot of times as number of sets we do. Probably over the first year and a half I coached him, a lot of our progression and strength progress came from a slow little manipulation and increase to his total sets done, specifically on bench press and squat. We actually didn't do much on deadlift, because we tend to, I personally, and especially for Patrick, tend to rely a lot on squat to be able to drive deadlift progress. But we use that increase in total sets and total volume to be primarily the main driver of what got us total from like the mid 1500s to that mid 1600 range. But at that point, we started to kind of hit a wall a little bit, especially on bench press, where just adding more volume wasn't doing anything. And actually, at one point, we actually had increased to 4 bench days a week, and it just didn't really do anything. So we actually backed off to 3 bench days a week, because my thought process was, let's just make 3 days harder versus 4 days with more volume. And so we started manipulating things. His total sets for the most part stayed the same, but we started doing, 1, working to higher relative intensities and exertion rates, and then 2, doing more top sets. So if before maybe he did 3 top sets on bench and 3 back offs, a lot of times now we're doing straight sets. If I'm programming something at, let's say, like a 7 RPE, he's doing straight sets with that weight versus doing 3 sets and then backing off. To do kind of some more submaximal volume. He just didn't respond to that submaximal work as well. And the same thing for squat. Squat, what we really had to do is we had to start pushing that secondary day as well. Whereas before, we really used that primary day to drive our intensity-based training and our secondary day to be more volume-based. He wasn't seeing progress from that anymore. So we had to really start pushing intensity on both days to be able to continue to see progress. And while we kind of got stuck for probably about 6 months at one point, the last year, since we've kind of implemented these changes, because that 6 months was kind of where we were stuck of just kind of, I was kind of spinning my wheels on continuing to use volume as this main tool for adaptation. When I switched focus and started driving intensity more, we added another 100 pounds of his total. Now he's into the upper 1700 pound or total range at 93 kilo. So we really saw this kind of stopping point where more volume wasn't better. And that's going back to 2015 in particular, we saw a lot in powerlifting of just do more volume. Like people were squatting 5 days a week and benching 5 days a week and deadlifting 3 days a week to think more volume was always going to be better, and it's not. Eventually that volume is going to have a diminishing effect. We just can't keep pushing that more and more and more. And not only can we not keep pushing that more and more for anyone, I think it even happens even more so once we start to get to those more advanced stages, because if we aren't loading that ball with a heavy weight, we probably aren't going to see much of the adaptations we want to. And that goes back to one of those initial reasons I talked about is for Patrick, he's pretty much well maxed out his frame. While yes, he probably still could add some muscle. I mean, he's at a point where adding a half a pound of muscle a year might be amazing progress. So we're more maximizing the potential of the current muscle he has. So if we're looking at novice, intermediate, maybe at that point we're building muscle, and then through that time we're integrating strength-based movements and more competition specificity at certain times during the training year to be able to maximize the current muscle we have. But once we get to an advanced lifter, we've probably maximized our muscle mass. So our potential for strength has kind of reached a ceiling when it comes to adding more tissue to our body. Now we just need to take the tissue and the lean muscle we have and maximize its potential through neurological effects. And that's where, like I said, when I look at volume versus intensity, while this isn't some set in stone standard, I look at volume more as this ability to be able to physiologically change our body and adapt it. And I look at intensity, and whether it's relative or absolute, as our way to create more neurological adaptations. Another example would be a lifter going from a novice to an intermediate. And a great example I have of that is Payton, who I've already alluded to when I kind of discussed how he responded really well to junk volume, or really submaximal volume. With Payton, he had just started lifting. I had coached him, and only 6 months prior had he touched the weight for the first time. So he was very new. And actually, the first time we ever met, we were kind of discussing goals and whatnot. And he had mentioned how he wanted to compete in the 83 kilo division. And I told him right off the bat, you will probably never compete in the 83 kilo division. You're 6'1". We need to build you up over the next 4 or 5 years to compete in the 105 kilo division. He had so much room to grow. And so he was going to be a very high responder to volume. We needed to do a lot of bodybuilding work, and while we needed to have some type of competition specificity to improve his ability and technique on the movements, we used very low intensity. We'd sometimes go 4 months or so without touching anything over about 80%, just because it wasn't about how heavy we could go. It was about perfecting movement at that time, and it was about using all of those accessory movements to really build muscle through high volumes in that phase, to eventually then have blocks here and there where we kind of test out, and we'd see this dramatic strength increase every single time we came back to be able to kind of test his strength on these after 2, 3, 4 blocks of a lot of really submaximal technique work and really pushing volume through bodybuilding movements. So that worked for a long time. For about a year, I think he probably added 200 pounds to his total in that first year from doing little to no heavy work on the squat, bench, and deadlift on a regular basis, just very sporadically. But we started to see that kind of have diminishing effects. Eventually we started to see that we needed to start progress those competition movements, and that's kind of that phase I saw. Just like Patrick, we saw that kind of point where he was not progressing in that intermediate phase of kind of ramping volume, and we needed to progress more to intensity, and I kind of saw that as that transition to the advanced phase. I saw this with Payton, of where he was no longer getting the same benefit from what I consider a novice style program, so we had to start working more into an intermediate phase. We had to back off a bit of the amount of accessory movements we were doing. We had to increase the total workload, total sets of his competition movements, and be more specific with those. We had to do less variations, and we had to do more of the competition squat, competition bench, and competition deadlift to really be able to drive his progress. And that's what I really see is, again, you see this novice to intermediate to advanced stage progression, and you see these, as a coach, when you go through these, it's a very obvious point when you see this stalling out for 2 to 3 months, and you see how there has to be a change in focus of what the current athlete's needs are. To wrap this all up, as I mentioned from the get-go, this was not some set in stone standard that you should be applying to every single individual. More of just my ramblings of my thought process that goes into how I view volume and intensity, how I adjust it, how I look at it between a novice, intermediate, advanced, and how I might approach things when I start seeing stalls in progress. What you can really take from this is not some kind of framework and groundwork from what you 100% need to do. It's more of an idea of kind of to understand that volume and intensity both have their place within training. We need to be selective on which ones we're using to produce strength adaptations at certain points. That's the point of planning our training versus just kind of going as a whim each day, but rather having this kind of long-term outlook of what we need to do, and being able to understand things that we need to improve. If we need to get bigger, we need to probably do more volume. If we need to get stronger, we probably need to do more intensification-based phases. So it really just kind of lays the groundwork for kind of how to think about this, how to approach it, and when you are kind of thinking of volume versus intensity, kind of a general idea of kind of this conceptual manner of how it can be applied. So if you found this beneficial, make sure to subscribe, like the video. It really does help, and I appreciate if you made it all the way through this rambling and discussion. I appreciate you listening to this whole thing, as it was a lot of kind of deep thought process when it comes to powerlifting programming. So talk to you later.